Thank you, Justin. You got that right, so well done. Welcome, everyone. So welcome all the industry leaders and every passionate individual joining us today for this pivotal panel discussion on advancing racial equity in built environment. So my name is Sonny Thomas Obasuyi. I was recently elected on the Governing Council to represent the young members' seat. I'm happy to stand before you all today as we kind of unite our efforts to drive meaningful transformation in our profession and industry. In today's digital age, data is not merely a number, it's a narrative that our community, as a reflection of our current state and our trajectory. It's concerning to note that only 37% of our members have chosen to share their ethnic backgrounds within their profile. By sharing this information, we aren't just filling out a form, we are contributing to a clearer and more transparent image of our community, which will aid in targeting our interventions. So I urge each member to take a moment to fill in their demographic data to ensure that all the information is up to date. Doing so empowers the RSS to take actionable and benchmark and measures tangible progress. So the RSS isn't just observing change, we aim to be at the forefront with enhancement in the rules for the rules of conduct. So we're strengthening our commitment to providing resources and guidelines and illuminating case studies. It's important to note that both the members, industry experts have been working together to develop a deliver the rules of conduct that actually kind of really works and is more in tune to current kind of standards. So we need representation at all leadership levels with our profession and industry, and to find a kind of rightful place at the decision-making table. While we boost a plethora of skilled professionals, systematic barriers and often hinders the ascent to leadership in key positions, let us be more proactive and encourage peers to seek out opportunities, nominate potential leaders, exercise your voting rights, and ensure that our representation is diverse as the community we serve. So it's important to our members to drive that change. But as we kind of delve into today's discussion, I hope we just don't listen, but more truly hear to ensure that absorbing insights and experience and aspirations are shared across the board. And with unity and determination, we have the power to reshape the built environment into a beacon that equity and inclusion. And let's pledge to make this vision more a reality and started today. So thank you, and let's have an impacting dialogue. So I would like to welcome Mark Harrison from CIOB to the panel.
Thank you, Sonny. Good afternoon, everyone. I was told we were having a panel discussion, so I hope to have some panelists join me on the stage. So Lorraine, Violet, Priya and Helen, would you kindly take your seat? Thank you. Thank you very much. I know we've had some issues with public transport, so thanks for getting here. As you've heard, my name is Mark Harrison, and I am the head of EDI Transformation at the Chartered Institute of Building. And I want to thank you all for coming here today. I think the first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge my privilege, my personal privilege, the privilege that I have in my role, and also the privilege of chairing this excellent panel discussion. And As I hope you're aware, we're going to be talking about how we identify the barriers to a more inclusive and representative sector. Okay, so I was invited to chair this panel today by my colleagues in the organisations. The logos are at the front there, some very nice work from Sybil and Paloma in getting this all organised, and I know it's been a lot of work, so thank you for that. But I also think it's worth mentioning the network and the partnership working we've done. As some of you may be aware, we signed a memorandum of understanding.
Anyway, I told her, don't leave the profession. You've studied hard to become a chartered town planner. It's taking you not, at least 5 to 6 years to get to where you are. And so I encouraged her to stay put, and I then set out to set up a network. And that is the beginning of BAME Planners Network. And so we collaborate with other organizations, other institutions, and we also reach out to BAMEs to ensure that they can engage in the planning process. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pugh. I work as a Diversity and Inclusion Ambassador for BPIC. And BPIC was founded 3 years ago. We're a built environment inclusion network on a mission to accelerate ethnic minority representation in the built environment. And we're also very passionate about encouraging young people into the sector and making it an attractive choice as an option for them to get in as a career choice. When I'm not working for BPIC, I also work for Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing as a Senior Marketing Communications Manager. Really excited to be here with this esteemed panel. I'm sure there'll be lots of insights that we can all share. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. So the first question that we have, I think I'll come to you, Lorraine, if that's all right, in the first instance. It's something you've touched upon. In recent years, we've seen an increasing emphasis on the EDI agenda on the word equity rather than equality. Perhaps acknowledging that we don't all have the same starting point. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether that reframing of the agenda is useful, it's necessary, particularly in respect of the recruitment of underrepresented young people into the sector.
Okay. To answer that, I do believe that the reframing of the EDI agenda in relation to equity is important, especially in relation to recruitment. Equity is basically where you create a level playing field so that everybody has an opportunity to achieve and be successful in what they're doing. Equality, if you're treating everybody the same, which is what a lot of businesses and organisations have actually been practicing, you find we're in a situation where we're in now where there are very few racial diversity in senior management, and we are not necessarily getting the younger people to join our organisations in terms of the built environment. Some of the experiences I've had in terms of equity, examples of equity in recruitment, has been, for example, going to schools and in areas where there's underrepresentation in the industry, so going to schools in areas where we wouldn't necessarily have young people joining the industry. Also, the way that we're advertising posts, I've seen that the job descriptions are more encouraging for people who would not necessarily be encouraged to join the built environment. And we're having more diverse interview panels. We're ensuring within the recruitment stages we are getting a diverse range of candidates to be interviewed, and this is all part of the process of how you advertise the jobs and the areas that you make sure you advertise to encourage people who may not necessarily normally be within the sector in terms of racial diversity. Yeah, I think the other thing that's important is that the interview panels in terms of recruitment are diverse, and that
one of the key things that I've observed from speaking to a lot of organizations and individuals in the space of recruitment is often, and this is often overlooked, is your shop front. As an organization, how are you perceived? many people would go on your website, and if all they see are just white, middle-class male, they are not likely to apply because it will be, I'm not going to fit in. Talking, another point in the shop front, the shop front analogy is, again, what's your street cred? There are some organizations that people talk about that organization, you don't want to work there, they are very racist. And that's just because there's been a manager there who was racist. So people hear all these stories on the streets and they are not interested in working for that organization. So it's very important that whilst we look at our practices, how we recruit, it's also important that we look at how we are seen, how are we projected through our websites, through our, things that is being said about us on the streets.
Fantastic, thank you. You give me a perfect segue onto the next question, actually, so thank you, Helen. The Violet, if I can come to you, you represent black professionals in construction today, and they have had significant success, as we know, since launching in 2019 at publicising black professional role models in the sector, which is excellent, but it is still a relatively small number of role models that we see in the sector, and that's why the work is necessary. I wonder if we can ask for your thoughts on what you think that lack of role models, what impact that might have on young people coming into the sector.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a topic I'm really passionate about when we talk about role models. I started my working life when I was 15 years old. And I'm 39 now. I know I don't look it. Thank you, Mum, for the good genes. And I got into my first leadership role about 8 years ago. And I should have got into my first leadership role probably about 3 or 4 years before that. And it's not because of self-entitlement, because I was more than capable. I had all of the ingredients of what would make an ideal candidate in terms of a leadership position. I had the skill set, I had the drive, I had the ambition, had the emotional intelligence, all of that good stuff that we look for when we're trying to hire people or when we're trying to get them into positions of leadership. But it took me a long while to get there, and for a really long time, it was a very disheartening feeling to feel like I was never going to get there. It was a very big mountain to climb. And that's largely because I didn't see people who looked like me. And that knocked my confidence a lot of the time, because even though I had all the ingredients, I didn't necessarily always have the confidence to go for job opportunities, because I thought, I'm missing this, I'm missing that. I need, this. You go onto the websites, you see the board is all white, you don't see any directors that are representative, you don't see any of the head of departments that are representative, in these leadership positions. So it's it was a very challenging process for myself in that regard. So thanks to some mentors, I was able to get some guidance and support on how to navigate some of those barriers and how to really sort of help myself to set myself, I guess, for success to get my first senior leadership position. So to answer your question, I think that role models serve as a living example of what it looks like to achieve and be successful. And if young people are looking to the sector, they're not seeing people who look like them. Surely how can they be inspired or have the aspiration to even try? And I think it's really important what you said. It shouldn't just be about us sort of talking the talk, but actually how are we kind of positioning ourselves externally as well, but also how are we attracting those, that diverse pipeline of talent into organisations. I think it's a rather depressing notion when we see a lot of young people, which I meet quite a lot of them all the time, who are really excited about the prospect of working in the built environment because we have such a breadth of services and opportunities to make, different career paths. But at the same time, there's only so far that you can go. There's a glass ceiling that's there. So I think, as Sunny said earlier, we've got to be able to do more to have a workforce that's representative of the communities that we're serving. And I think that role models are crucial in addressing racial equality. And I think that importance extends just beyond individual career success. It's about organisational culture. It's about our industry reputation. And ultimately, if we want fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, more creativity, we want innovation, we've got to be doing more to have more senior leaders that are much more representative of the communities that we're serving. And I feel like we're doing a good job. I just don't think we're moving fast enough.
Thank you, Violet. Yeah, so not fast enough. And of course, it's not just an issue that relates to the built environment, is it? But yeah. Anyone want to disagree with that? Maybe not, maybe not. Would anyone like to add to it?
Well, I was going to add to it because a lot of what you said really resonates. I was quite privileged that I had very good mentors when I started out in Islington Council over 30 plus years ago. Even though I did not see anyone who looked like me, but because I was brought up in a country where I was, appreciated, I was a citizen. I didn't feel I was a second-class citizen. I was born in Nigeria, grew up in Nigeria, did my first, course in Nigeria before I came here in my early 20s. So I had that confidence. And I realized that blacks, especially, who were born and brought up in the UK, lacked the same confidence that I had. Yeah, I was able to progress quickly. Within 8 years, I was already in a senior position. But not many of those who were born in the UK had that same, that same, push to just make that progress. So having good mentors is also very, very important as to seeing role models. The second point I'd like to make is I'm often approached by young women, female, saying, wow, I've never met a planner in a senior position who is black and who is female. These were some of the things that made me start the BAME Planners Network, because I knew other women, I knew other blacks who were in senior position. I knew other Asians, other Chinese in senior position. And that is why our very first aim in the BAME Planners Network is to raise the visibility. So the more people see those who look like them, the more that they know there are people like them within planning, engineering, So it's important that we as networks, that we position ourselves. So it's not just good enough for us to be asking for more role models, but those who are there should be more visible. The other main points being made, I'm conscious of time, I can always elaborate if there's more time, is career progression. Almost 50%, and again, I've been there, I speak from experience, is career progression. In order for you to move up as a black person, I'm here speaking as a woman, black person, and on behalf of all the other groups, ethnic groups in the BAME Planners Network. In order to move up, you have to move out. Because there is always that proverbial glass ceiling. And even reading through what people said, I could easily say, yes, that happened to me in my 30 plus years career, whereby a lot of individuals come into an organization, they are highly educated, well qualified, they help in training others, and people who come in after them progress. And that's because of the color of their skin, because of the water cooler treatment. Again, preferences are given right from when they come in. They are given better projects to deal with. They are invited to meetings that a non-white would attend. And so when the promotion comes in, or the examination or interview, they, of course, will scale through. And at times, this even starts from even secondary schools, where a child is being groomed to be a leader, and not the black child is being groomed to be a leader. So we can go on and on about it, but I'm not, I'll just make it brief. So, more than 50% was about career progression, being overlooked for promotion, and of course, I've mentioned that progression bar. The third one I'd like to mention is one of support. Many of those who responded did not feel well supported. They felt that their managers, well, some people use the word, were racist. That's the way they felt, So they didn't feel supported in their role. They felt unappreciated. And some even spoke about being in an organization for 16 years. And just for me to draw an attention to what we as a network we are doing, there's a lady again who reached out to me after we set out. This lady had been in an organization for a long time, couldn't get promotion, gone for interviews and a lot of other things. And I said, you know what? let's see your CV. We looked at her CV and we then told her, next time you go for a job, call us. She called one, so she called the network. We then gave her a coach, and this coach prepared her for the interview. When she got to that organization that offered her a job, she didn't just get one promotion, because she's been working at a principal level at the organization she was working at, but they did not promote her. This organization took her on, said, even though you came for a senior position, we can see you are very experienced and qualified, and they immediately gave her a principal position. And this is the power of networking. She would have remained there frustrated. She actually told me when she called me, I'm sorry that I stole her away from you guys. She was actually going to become a surveyor. She said to me, I'm leaving planning. And she said, I'm leaving planning. I want to go and retrain and apply to be a surveyor. I said, but you've got all this experience, don't do that. And today she's happy. Yes. And so she's happy, and she's, as we speak, applying for the role of a team leader. This is someone who sat in the same organization for a decade, no promotion, and within 2-3 years is now aspiring. So those are some of the key points I want to bring out. It's about the culture of the organization. It's about career progression. How are you supporting your staff to move up? Don't overlook your staff. Don't bring people from outside and promote them over your staff. You've nurtured them. They've been loyal, they've served, they are dedicated. If there are issues, work with them. I've been in position where, and I'll finish shortly, where, on day one, I started a role. I won't mention the local authority. And I was told, that person worked them out. And I was thinking, I don't do that. And this person was of Chinese origin. And what I did instead was to work with this person, understand why they were not performing. And then I saw that there were, anyway, I won't go into too many stories, but there were so many other issues external. Someone else in the office was actually stirring them up, and they were just getting angry. In a meeting, I saw this person physically, did something to this guy, and this guy just lost it. So as a manager, because I knew what was happening, I was able to coach him. And before I left that organization, I actually got him a promotion. And so again, it resides on us as managers, not to just think about, oh, that person is not good in English, that person is too quiet, that person cannot speak. All they might need is someone to encourage them, motivate them, and support them. Thank you.
Thank you. Some great insights there. I hesitate to ask, but can anyone follow that? No. Okay.
No, I just say I totally agree with you. All the things that you've mentioned, I've experienced, I've witnessed. I've been in the industry 40 years, and can totally agree. When you're sitting there, I was like nodding away like anything. I think, unfortunately, the whole issue about retention is really very important, and it's 39%. I think is probably not an unusual percentage in terms of people wanting to leave their current organisations to go elsewhere because they're not getting the support. They are being overlooked. They are experiencing the, like you say, people coming in who are junior, they train people, possibly they get promoted above them. So I think all the things that you've mentioned, I was just like, yeah, those are all the things in my notes. Those are the things that people experience, and we have to change that. We have to change that, change the culture. And as you've mentioned, from the top, it has to come from the top. We need to have more representation at senior leadership so that we can influence what decisions are being made and what strategies are being put in place to support ethnically diverse people within the built environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It strikes me it's not just the employee there losing out, being frustrated, having to leave. It's also the employer that's losing out for a lack of that sponsorship that we're talking about. So, okay, I think I've got a time for a group question before Q&A. Is that correct? Okay, I'll do it anyway. Sorry, I shouldn't keep picking on you. One word or a phrase we hear a lot in my line of work in EDI is when we talk to employers about initiatives in respect of recruitment and fair, transparent recruitment is employers will often say, those who resist the idea of EDI in particular will say, we don't need all this EDI stuff because we will just employ the best people for the job. And, clearly if we look at the underrepresentation in the sector, we've heard the stories, real people's lives that have been impacted by disadvantage and discrimination. So I guess, what strikes me is that it's all about this word meritocracy. Is it something that we have in the sector, or is it something that we should be working towards? I'll open that up to the panel.
Well, I would like to start by saying, by whose standard? How is merit? How is it judged? You have organizations like the civil service who conduct tests, and most of those tests are more, whether it's been admitted or not, they do not favor certain people, groups of people. So the tests themselves, whilst it's being set out to look for merit, it then depends on what exactly are you looking at. So the way that they are set out might disadvantage people who are even neurodiverse. We're not just talking right now about ethnic diversity. We're talking about all forms of diversity. How will that affect someone with neurodiversity? There are people who are not very, very eloquent in their speaking, yet you want them to come to an interview and speak as eloquently as someone who hasn't got a speech impediment. So whilst we are talking about merit, it's very important for us to ask ourselves, how are we measuring these standards? By whose standards? We also have to recognize that affinity bias comes out not only when we see people, but also come out in the way people respond to things. And before I leave the subject, we were working, that's as a network, with a very big organization in planning. And they were telling us that they haven't got any diverse set of employees. And the question I ask is it that when you advertise for a job that you don't get anyone applying? And they told us that the last interview they did, they had about 12% applicants. 12% of the applicants were from BAMEs, but not a single person got through the selection process. Not one. And the question I asked was, that should tell you something about your process. Again, it has to be examined. And that's what I like to say, is that it's by whose standard.
Thank you, Helen. You mentioned affinity bias, and it reminded me of a conversation I had when I was, as EDI people, we get invited to sit on interview panels because that just fixes it, really. That's all you need to do. I was looking at the interview questions, and there was a question at the bottom was, what are they're intending to ask all the candidates, what are your hobbies? And I said, well, what's that? How are you going to mark that question? And they said, well, we just want to find out if someone will be a good fit in the team. And I thought, well, actually, don't you want people who might have a different perspective, anyway. So thank you for that. Anyone else want to come in on meritocracy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just very briefly, I think the assertion that organisations can simply hire the best people is really just oversimplifying the whole recruitment process. And as we've all talked about, I think even the best intentioned people can have some of those unconscious biases that we talked about earlier. Not everyone has equal access to education, to the networks, to the resource, to the mentors, to the sponsors, which I think then continues to perpetuate inequality. So I think that while as you've talked about as well, there's cultural fit sometimes where people are being hired because you look the part, you sound the part, you hang out with the right people, and all that stuff that really isn't necessarily fair. So I think the concept of meritocracy is aspirational, but it's not always fully realised in practice. And I think this is where EDI initiatives can help to readdress some of those inequalities and create fairer processes.
Thank you very much. Okay. Anyone want to come in on that, or shall I open it up? I think we've got 5 minutes. Would anyone have a question from the floor? Please. I think we've got a mic coming down.
Hi, my name is Carolina Lopato. I'm a building surveyor. I'm aspiring to become a chartered building surveyor, hopefully soon. I really like what has been mentioned today, but my question is, you talk about representation, you talk about retention, how we can avoid to fall into tokenism? Because that's something that you can see many companies saying, like, oh, we are diverse. You see a lot of pictures in the website with all these sort of colors, flavors, and shapes, but there is a lot of tokenism, and I think we should also talk about that, how we avoid that.
Thank you. So, panel, how do we avoid tokenism?
I don't mind.
Priya?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think as one of the biggest challenges that comes up in EDI initiatives is how to avoid it looking like you don't actually care. And I think there is sort of two issues with this. There's this company which has just taken all of their diverse people in the company and put them in a group shot on their website so it looks like they are really diverse, and that is about 5 people, and wow, they must be diverse. And then there's the issue coming from those who are underrepresented, who feel like they're just being used and being put forward because they represent certain characteristics. And I think is really important for a company which isn't very diverse to first and foremost acknowledge, look, hold your hands up and say, we aren't very diverse, but we want to put the work in. And we know that in order to attract more diversity, we do need to sometimes, put forward some of our more diverse individuals, but not use them all the time. I think it's really important that you're asking people, do you want to be part of this? And not just assume that because they are minoritized, they will have a lived experience that they want to share. At the end of the day, everybody has a lived experience. It's not just unique to those who are from underrepresented backgrounds, and we shouldn't use and abuse that term in a way that we are putting forward people, having them share their story because it's a nice thing to do. I think it's just important that we ask people, do you want to take part in this initiative? And if they don't want to, it's okay. And then the company has to put the work in. At the end of the day, you can't use your 5 diverse people to be your representation on your website, on your marketing, put them on your diverse panel. It doesn't work like that. The company has to acknowledge it and really, really put that work in.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a minute, 2 minutes perhaps. Chairman.
Hiya, Sharon Slinger, Constructing Rainbows. London's very ethnically diverse. There's other parts of the country that are not. Which causes different challenges for people from ethnically diverse backgrounds. What tips have you got for people that live in different parts of the country into how they can support their employees when there's no kind of black networks around in the regions?
Well, I'd like to take that. To start with, yes, there are many areas in the UK that do not have a diverse community, and that again can pose a problem. And one of the things that we talk about is the fact that encouraging that person within your organization to not, to have that sense of belonging, so that as an organization, you are not always making out that they are different. It's making sure that you learn more about their culture, even if it means having special days whereby you just open it up as an international day and do things that other people in that organization can learn about that person's own, in terms of their culture. And talking about networks, most networks now are online. So there are lots of networks like ours. We meet online. We have a very active WhatsApp group. We are nearly 200, and we have people, I can see, someone smiling at me there. We have almost 200 on the platform. And people live in Scotland, they live in Ireland, and they're all there. They're all planners, and we even have non-planners because the network itself It's not just for planners, but anyone who associates with our aims and objectives. So again, it's encouraging them to know about that network. Also encouraging them to also start up a network. It doesn't have to just be within your organization, because there might be other organizations in that same area that also have the lone BAME in that organization. And of course, your EDI, what's in your EDI strategy? How are you going to promote that? So that's your starting point. Even though you might not have a diverse workforce, and right now, we're talking about diversity, and I think we keep focusing, I don't know whether the title of the event is not talking about just race. So when we're talking about diversity, there is so many. There is the gender issue, we've talked about neurodiversity, sexual orientation. So there's about 11 characteristics. So it's not just thinking and focusing, because being a black person is very visible, I'm black. Being a woman is very visible, I'm a woman. But I might have other forms of things that make me diverse or different. So the starting point for an organization is looking at EDI across the spectrum and then working at a strategy. How do we deal with this? So when you then get someone, and it could be anyone from any of those groups, then you know exactly how you are going to make them to fit into your organization and to then welcome them in. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for a very comprehensive response. I hope that's okay, Sharon. Right, I'm very conscious of the fact we've overrun by 2 minutes, which I'm very disappointed about. That's down to my appalling chairing of the meeting. But we've had some fantastic insights, and I don't want to interrupt anyone. So please, will you join me in thanking our fantastic panelists? I think I'm in, followed by Diane, is that right? Yeah, sorry.
All right, yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic discussion. Up next, I would like to welcome Dr. Diane Dumashie. She's going to share her insights and experiences as the director of Dumashie Limited, a fellow of the RICS, and current president of the International Federation of Surveyors. Deriving strength from a broad commercial background, Diane has a proven track record of success in initiating, managing, and delivering urban and rural-based economic and regeneration projects within the UK and Africa, ensuring that knowledge is transferred to client teams. Diane has led many large and complex projects in the public, private commercial, and NGO sectors, and is passionate in her commitment to sub-Saharan Africa, assisting in women's programs to alleviate poverty and facilitate gender equality in land and property. Welcome, Dan.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Sybil, for that introduction. And I think it's, what I've just heard on this panel really sort of is going to be reflected, I think, in a lot of what I'm just about to say in terms of my lived experience. You've heard from Sybil, I'm the president of the International Federation of Surveyors, known as FIG, and that's a federation of member associations. And the RICS, which is my professional body, is a really active player in that network. My background you've heard about from Sybil, so I'll not go into that in detail. But I was asked to tell you my story in about 5 to 10 minutes, which I think is a bit unfair because I've been around a few decades, but I'll give it a go. But importantly, just to try and draw out and make some observations, which I hope will add to the discussions and debate today. Look, we know what the problems are. We know there are these barriers. Maybe they're hurdles, because when you think of a hurdle race, you can knock them down and keep going. So just, that's language and semantics perhaps. But what I really liked, what I heard earlier, was about this word, equality versus equity. And I think I'm going to add to that as I go through what I say. But I would also add one other thing, and that's the word evolution. Because I reckon in order to address some of these issues, barriers, hurdles, whatever you call them, we have to understand the concept of evolution. So let's just sort of say one big opportunistic thing. our profession, our sector in the land and built environment really has an opportunity to lead the professions, all of the professions, on what diversity and inclusion looks like. And I know we've been trying for some years, and I get that expression, we're not going fast enough, but do you know, we still have that opportunity because nobody else is going fast enough either. Okay, so let me just start with my story, and it's about graduation, when I graduated, to becoming the president of the International Federation of Surveyors, FIG, which incidentally I was elected and I started January this year. A couple of general reflections, and these are the positives of me and my time. You know, my mindset forever since graduating was to be curious, it was to be continuously looking and searching to develop myself, but also adaptive and importantly, a discoverer, you know, be an adventurer whilst out there. Secondly, I was really mindful of those that had gone before and going with me at the time. And that doesn't necessarily mean just in the land and build profession, it's across society actually. And so I think about diversity, which some of you know, a network in London mostly, and in 2022 really highlighted those champions, and I applaud Diversity for doing that when in their month. Do I see Bola out there in the background? You did a lot of work for that. The other thing I applaud is that many have helped, and I think it was Helen who said it, one of the panelists, that, you know, those that help you and you embrace them, because what goes around comes around, you help others too. And it need not just be in the BAME community, it can be in any community. So that's an important thing. And the last thing that I would say in terms of a positive is I've chosen my battles. I don't fight everyone, I fight some of them, and I choose which ones I'm going to do. Nobody else chooses for me, by the way. So my journey then is one of adaptation and discovery. And I'm going to do it in two little bits, the first of which is really my personal timeline through the decades, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but it will be through a timeline, and that also reflects in society's timeline as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned. And then the second thing is the workforce. Very much we were listening to recruitment, retention, etc. So, okay, the early footprints of me in my career. And we've heard it a couple of times. No one looked like me when I came out of college and started in the profession. So I thought, aha, I'm going to have a strategy because I want to get to London. The big bright lights, of which are shining in my eyes right now, the bright lights of London, that's where I want to work. I couldn't get hired by any of the big four. The Greater London Council, there's a little tip there on my age, the Greater London Council did hire me. And they hired me because they had, call it tokenism, thank you for that question earlier, by the way, they had what we would say now, a policy of diversity. Absolutely. But, you know, I felt a bit uncomfortable with this, and it was like, you know, I'm not a token, I'm something more. And within 6 months, I'd gone into one of the big four consultancies in London. Once I'd got my letters, I realized, yeah, you know what I'd say probably? I was at a glass ceiling already. So I did actually move into the corporate life. And corporate life treated me really well. And I think it's because they weren't thinking property, they were thinking business. And this actually suited my temperament because I tend to cross-fertilize with ideas and my approach and that curious mindset I like to think I've got. And so, yes, I became a property director at age 30. But, you know, I wasn't actually satisfied with that. Having worked for Allied Lyons, Marks & Spencer, all those names back then, no, I wanted to go off and do a PhD, prove myself a bit more. So I did my PhD, and out of that, I found that the doctor helped me. I'll come back to how it helped me in a bit. But I was also, at that point, invited to go into the Big Four. Hurrah! So off I went. I joined the Big Four yet again. And if you like, this was the transition to my next chapter. Because in that Big Four, glass ceiling. And I just didn't fit, actually. So I hung in there a couple of years for the purposes of my CV. And then I exited and started my own practice. And that was a good thing, because I realized I didn't fit, because I wanted to expand. You know, and I didn't want to work in a tightrope of the consultancy practices. And also I was starting, and this is my second chapter, if you like, it was the chapter where I was saying, do you know, I'm going to carve my own path ahead. And it was a parallel chapter, and it was a chapter where people did start to look like me. Because in parallel to working in the UK, I started working internationally. And by doing so, I was in different cultures, in, you know, whatever colour, I was there, and I fitted somehow in that colour range. So they all started looking like me. Great. So by doing my own thing, it meant I could choose where I was working when, to a degree, because he who pays the piper. But it enabled me to leverage who I actually was and who I am. And the confidence, and I heard the word confidence earlier, the confidence I gained from that enabled me to keep on stepping up. So I was working, though, interestingly, and I pitched myself as an interim consultant. Interim then wasn't really known. It's very well known now. But having read Charles Handy and economics, portfolio working is what I was about. So I was working for the public sector. They got me. They used me as an interim. You know, NHS, the regional development agencies and the like. Those people, I was doing prestigious jobs as an independent. But in parallel, I also wanted to step up. And here it became where I was volunteering in the community as well as helping the profession. And I was trying my best to engage on decision-making platforms. And this is where my professional body really helped me, the RICS. So I was in local committees, I was in the regional committees, I was then on governing council, and then I found the work I was doing in the International Federation was building and building and building, and building my profile. I talked about a doctorate. I realized when I did my doctorate, I'm no academic, so I wasn't going to stay there, but those letters really had currency around the world. And as we speak today, you'll see lots of honorary doctors because there is currency in it. So I was in these international forums, knowledge platforms, and diaspora, working with and at that level. Things like organisations like the Commonwealth Association of Land Economists, CASL, it's known, some of you may know it. FIG, you know well about. I've gone through the ranks in that organisation for 18 years to get where I am now. And then, of course, the international work, both voluntary as well as income fee earning. Climbing higher, really wanted to do that. And so we need to do this in our own land and built environment sector. And I think I'm now moving away from my own journey to picking up some of the things I've heard. We have to climb higher. Yes, we might have to do it faster, but you know, we've got to do it at a pace, I would suggest. But there really is a need for a multi-generational approach to the how we do this. And I mentioned right at the beginning the two phrases, equality and equity. That way around is important. Because my life, my journey, was just trying to be on an equal footing. It was about equality. Now, the generations below me are demanding, quite rightly, for equity. And that's what we've got to actually really push for. It's good. But as I say, we need that multi-generational approach to figure it out. Because we have been doing things, but what can be done that's slightly different? And I would say, you know, young surveyors, bringing them in has got to be the biggest, big must. I went to We Rise. It's another network. Some of you may know that. Some of you may be in the room. Wow, I was like, all these young surveyors, young professionals, not just surveyors, all these black, brown, young people in the professions. They're brilliant. They're leading. They're successful. They're still grappling with the issues I grappled with in my journey. So, you know, something's got to change here.
Members, I suppose one could say of the MOU with the organisations you see at the front. Great to be here. Hi, Chanel Gray. I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Savills. I joined Savills last year. Before then, I worked for the Civil Service, doing a number of HR and D&I roles there.
Hi, Catherine Greville. I am the Head of Fairness, Inclusion and Respect at the Supply Chain Sustainability School. The school is a collaboration of industry participants who originally were set up to upskill the entire built environment sector workforce to make sure that we can move towards sustainability. So the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect program sits within the school and is really focused on cultural change and many of the things that we've heard about today.
Thank you. Asita Madhu, High Speed 2, Senior Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager, looking after the supply chain, so supply diversity, tendering, contract management, that's the sort of remit of my work.
So I think you can probably gather it's a very broad spectrum of panelists, and hopefully we'll have some really interesting responses. But let's just start on the, picking up from the previous session about culture and organizational culture. And I've always felt that, the culture of an organization is determined by the worst behavior accepted, right? So if I was to come to you, Chanel, in terms of organizational culture, why is culture and the behaviors of leaders really important?
So culture absolutely has to be top down. It cannot be bottom up, because you're fighting systems that you weren't part of creating and that you have no real influence on changing. So definitely senior leaders have to own this. They have to be accountable for this as well, because there are different cultures. There's an organizational culture, but then there are different cultures within teams, within divisions. So as the heads of those teams, the heads of those divisions, the accountability really should be with you to start with, on taking ownership of what that looks like, what those behaviours are, what you're willing to accept, how work gets disseminated, how people get how people progress within your teams and your divisions, and what work they get. So for me, I think that absolutely the first thing that they should be doing is just talking to their people, asking them the questions about how does it actually feel to work here? Is it sustainable to continue to work like this over the length of your career in this way? Is the culture here created to enable you to have a long career in this organisation, to progress and to have all the things that you need for it to do? When you ask that question, you have to be ready for the answers for it. The absolute worst possible thing that you could do as a senior leader is somebody tells you how it feels, and then you gaslight them and say, well, actually, there might be a reason for that, and I'm sure it wasn't intended in that way, and I'm sure that that's not the way that it actually happened. No, if you're going to ask the questions, be prepared for the answers that you're going to get, and then also put some measures in place into how you're going to target them. You cannot put the onus on cultural change on your ERGs. You cannot put them on well-meaning volunteers who are passionate about this, who really want to help, because they're not the ones that broke the system, they're not the ones that fix it. So that's for me.
But here's a bit of a follow-on. In order to make the change at the very top, you need to have diverse leaders, right?
Yes.
We currently don't have that. How do we get there?
I think it's a really difficult question, because for me, there's a huge focus on bringing in diversity at kind of entry level, so grads, apprentices, that sort of thing, which I think is absolutely great, and I think that is a really good way to start. But as mentioned in the previous panel, if people come into an organisation and the culture doesn't fit where they come from, they don't see people like themselves, there's bad behaviours happening there, you will not keep them. So they won't become your senior leaders of tomorrow. So the culture thing absolutely has to be dealt with first before you put all of your efforts and your money and everything into bringing people in, because you just won't keep them.
Michelle.
Oh, yeah, so I think there's the way you framed the question, I'm not sure. So I think you need leaders committed to make the change for that to happen. I don't think they necessarily have to come from a specific background. Actually, one could argue that there's nothing more problematic for this agenda than somebody who looks like me but doesn't care about this agenda. And so I think it's about that commitment. And I think so if you've got the leaders who are committed, who are going to make the change, who are going to put the yards in and do some of the stuff that Shannon has talked about, and not leave it up to ERGs. And I have to say, I'm so grateful. It's a little side note. I've been at RICS panels several times, and I feel like that I'm always saying, please don't leave it up to your ERGs. So it's really great to have somebody else say that as well. So as long as you have leaders who put the yards in who will do that, then it is possible. The only thing I would just add on to Chanel's thing, I think she's right, change can't be bottom up, but it can't only be top down. Mm-hmm. So it can't just be about what leaders do, because then you run the risk of leaders leaving that position or changing their mind or whatever, and some of that work falls away. So leaders have to also empower people within the organization so that the culture creates and recreates itself and becomes self-sustaining. I think once you start to hit that magic point, then you really start to see things shift.
You're nodding, Catherine.
Yeah, I am. It's interesting because we talk about the cultural change coming from the top down, absolutely, but also from the bottom up and everywhere in between, because I think we need to recognise that businesses and organisations across the built environment sector at different stages of their understanding and their initiatives to shift the dial. I'm a big believer in leadership being evident and available at all different levels. So I realise we talk about leadership as in getting into leadership roles, and absolutely that is one really important aspect. But some of the best leaders I have witnessed or had the pleasure of working with in my career have actually been coming from junior levels or at other levels in the organisation. And I think we really need to capitalise on the skills and the positivity and the enabling characteristics of people across our sector, and really build that together. And I think that's where the collaboration aspect of the change really comes in, that we can't leave it to the leaders. We've been leaving it to the leaders for 30 years, and we're still where we are. I think there were some really great points added about that earlier. Let's look at bringing all the different parts together and making sure we are really empowering people at all stages of their careers to drive the change, whether that be through teaching them how to be good allies, how to be ambassadors, how to actually make that change. And especially, I mean, I'm really, I admire a lot of the younger people coming into our sector, because as many people have mentioned earlier, they're not putting up with this is the status quo and this is what it's always been. In fact, they are driving change, and many businesses are having to listen, even if it's from the point of view of they can't get the right people, and that they need to listen. So I think there's a lot that our younger generations can add to this, and we need to bring them in on that as well.
Thank you. Now, before I just go on to the next question, Wasita, do you want to try and add anything to what's been said thus far?
In terms of cultural change,
yes.
I think a lot has been said already. I think it starts from the top down, because ultimately you have to set the tone. The senior leaders have to set the tone of the organisation. You've got corporate agendas to meet, you've got visions to achieve, you've got objectives to meet, and often that influences what then happens across the organisation. But more importantly is really living and being an exemplar. So having allies, having role models, having people who are committed to the diversity and inclusion agenda, I think is more important. And then the lived experience of staff and through their journey through the organisation is important. What organisation do you want to actually develop? And often you find that organisations, when it hits their bottom line, that's when they start to care about EDI. When it doesn't hit their bottom line, nothing changes. The culture still stays the same. So I think until you start to actually be more influential in that way, that's when you're going to see change.
So just before I go on to the next question, I'm sorry, I am going off script. When we talk about the bottom line now, it does make it seem as if the only reason we're going to get change is because of the bottom line. Is that the right way to go, or is that a necessary evil?
It's not the right way to go, but if we think about George Floyd and when Black Lives Matter, how many CEOs came out, how many leaders came out and made a statement? They were committed to addressing race as an issue. Some have never dealt with race before as part of their approach. They made all sorts of commitment, which several years later, have some of them actually carried that through? They haven't, because the reflection of that is there were many people making commitments. Ultimately, there were people who were saying, I won't join an organization that looks like this because they're not supporting people from my background. So ultimately, there's a sort of a backfire to that in the sense that commitment and action are two separate things. So making the commitment and carrying through the action is very much more important.
I think that's quite interesting. Let's go on to the next question. In the previous discussion, there was this quite a fair bit of time spent talking about equality and equity, right? And how that factors into meritocracy, which we would love in an ideal situation to work. But what advice, Osita, do you have for leaders who want to see a true meritocracy working within their organization?
It's an interesting question because when you think of meritocracy, and the way I see meritocracy, and certainly I've seen it in several organizations that I worked at, is really the belief that people have the ability to get there and the skills, and they work hard, they use their ability, they will get there. The reality is that doesn't really happen. There's only a small proportion of people who will get there. And so that's why and therefore they miss the opportunity to progress and get further. And that's what you see increasingly in most organizations play out. And so we're told that, yes, you get to a certain level, middle management, you now need to sort of work hard, get the next qualification to progress, but that's often not the case.
So again, soft skills, the teaching of them, I think that's what you're touching upon.
Yeah.
The soft skills that people acquire through not just formal education, but
Precisely.
informal education is also quite important. So how do we try and get that into the education system so that young people who are not as advantaged, dare I say, irrespective of their race or gender, how do we try and do that?
One of the things I say to a lot of young people, black or white, who are progressing and want a career is get an early work experience where you are. Don't wait till college or school to identify that. Whatever you're interested in, push for a work experience to get exposure to what you're interested in doing. And have conversations with people around it. That way you know what to do and how to sort of, don't wait to just get formal qualification and then do what others say is necessary to be merited to be into that career. So you have to be able to sort of be a bit more dynamic in doing that.
Chanel.
Just on the conversation of merit, I've been on record in saying that I think merit's a myth in the current systems that we perform in and that we operate in. I just do. I think that merit, I think Helen mentioned it before, I think merit exists because it benefited the people that lead organisations now. They were able to progress and they were able to be successful because of that definition of merit. That doesn't mean that we can find diverse thinking, and that's why you have kind of on diverse boards and you have people that all behave in the same way and act in the same way. We talk a lot in general, not specifically here, but we talk a lot about authentic leadership as well. But it's like, yes, be authentic, but not like that. Like actually it's this way that you be authentic, and it's this is the type of leadership that we want here. It's the same thing with the merit conversation. There absolutely has to be some sort of form of being able to identify talent, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Even taking job descriptions and applications, does every job need presentation skills? No, but if you're only assessing based off of presentation skills and not everybody can do them, you're only bringing in a certain type of person, a certain personality that feels comfortable standing in a room, being able to talk to strangers about a topic that they're a bit nervous about. So then you're bringing really kind of big characters into a space. And what about the people that are a bit quieter, that are a bit more reserved, that take time to consider their approach to something? They are just as important, and they bring just as much experience and talent into organisations as well. So I think that it starts with recruitment teams, having a look and making sure that all job descriptions are inclusive, that we're not just having the same structure of job descriptions going out, that you need Excel. Why? Like why does every job need Excel? Some absolutely do. Does every job need to be able to have all the skills that you've listed? And my favourite thing that I see on adverts now is we understand that women don't apply for jobs at the same rate as men because they don't think that they reach all the skills. That's all good on paper, but actually when it gets to the interview and it gets to the processes, what's there to benefit women when they do apply for those jobs and they go for it? Are they going to progress at the same rate as men? So yes, we say these things. Where's the action? We need to make sure that that's followed through in the ways that we perform our talent development, the culture that we mentioned before.
Catherine, you're nodding.
Lots of really great points. Actually, it makes me think of, I remember a story, the ex-commissioner of the Victorian Police in Australia used to tell about how back when she was going through the police force, they had a really big problem with getting women into the force. They had women applying and going through the courses and the training. It was really grueling training. And she got into her role and she looked at it and she said, bring me all the information about what you actually have to do to get into the police force. And so it came to her and she looked at it, and then one of the requirements was to scale a 6-foot wall, literally a brick wall. And she looked at it and she said, so do we really need all of our police officers to scale a brick wall? And it was a little bit of thought, and maybe not. And then I remember her telling the story of, well, how many women have actually been able to scale this 6-foot brick wall? And that's where the problem was. So she removed the requirement to scale a 6-foot brick wall, and literally women started coming into the police force. And it makes me think it's almost a metaphor for what are the brick walls that we have in terms of recruiting people into our sector. Because as you've identified, not everyone is out there doing presentations or would never get any work done. I think we want neurodiversity in our business across the sector for the creativity and the incredible talent that it brings. If you're asking everyone to present, a lot of my colleagues aren't comfortable presenting. They wouldn't go for that job, and yet they're some of the best people in their specialties that I know. So maybe if we think about it, is what brick walls are we putting up that we really don't need to have there? And what are some of the skills that we can be teaching? Because knowing Excel is one thing, but sending you on an Excel course so you can learn Excel if you can use the other technology is not actually a big deal. It might just be someone who's come out of their study or come from a different career path where Excel wasn't part of what they used.
Very good, very good. Rochelle?
Yeah, so because you were asking about, there was a question about meritocracy.
Yes.
When Helen was asked that question and she said, well, who defines merit? I think that's the question. And, I think as humans, we have a tendency to try and think through that. We can create the idea of some sort of average level of something, and from that we can start to make selections. And actually, we can't do that. There isn't an example in which we can do that. Catherine said the story about the brick wall, but Sybil was, I think you were in the, well, I'm not going to say, but you were in the army, or the armed services, and Air Force, it was the Air Force, because because there's the thing about planes. So they wanted to make an average cockpit, right? Because that will make making the planes much easier and much cheaper. You're going to make the cockpit, and it doesn't matter who you are or what size you are, you'll be able to sit in this cockpit. And they found that was impossible to do. You cannot make an average cockpit because people are too different and too distinctive from each other, and therefore you have to make them flexible and adjustable. And that's what we need to have. We need to have more flexibility, more adjustability, and a better understanding of what we want around the table, who we want around the table. And when we get there, we'll be getting somewhere, but we're pushing against a long history of actually there's a way in which we can just standardize something and make an average, and from that average we can try and work upwards.
And that point was made quite clearly in that book, Diverse Thinking by Matthew Said, about this thing about trying to get average and merit, especially when it comes to meritocracy in what we do, because ultimately, as members of the built environment, we all bring our own expertise, our own lived experiences into developing what we live in, right? So it's dependent on those who are assessing people to join firms to have a wider perspective and a wider selection criteria. And that's that's what we preach, and that's what we do within HOK. So I'm glad to see that. Conscious of time, Catherine, I think we were talking initially about data and how important it is to try and improve diversity, inclusion, equity. But what does the current data actually tell us about the ethnic racial representation?
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, I'd say from my perspective, you can't actually fix the problems unless you have the data to start with. So it's really important to participate in that and make sure you're gathering data about what your workforce makeup looks like and what your supply chain's workforce looks like as well. So the diversity survey is an annual survey that we run across the built environment sector. It had been running for 2 years. By the time we got last year's results, we've just closed for the 2023 results. Last year we have a capture of 270 businesses and almost 370,000 workers. So that is the largest data set held in the UK in our sector. To give you a comparison, I think the ONS data for construction, for example, is 55,000. So from that data, we know, for example, that It's a myth that people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds aren't attracted to our sector. We actually analysed the data, and from 367,000 applicants for the sector, almost 40%, 39.9% of applicants came from black or ethnic minority backgrounds. It touches on one of the points that was raised very well earlier. The issue is with the selection process. So we also track, out of all of those applicants, just how many get through into the sector. And we know that across every ethnic minority group, it is harder to get into the built environment sector if you come from a background that is non-white than if you are white. So, and it varies depending on what background you come from. So on average, if you come from an ethnic minority background, there's an average of 50 applicants to 1 successful hire. But that's an average, so it varies. If you come from a mixed ethnic minority background, for example, mixed with white, your statistics are looking much better, so it could be as low as 21 to 1. If you come from a, let's say, a Caribbean background, it's 33 to 1. If you come from an African background, it's 58 or so to 1. If you are actually Indian, it's 74 to 1. So you need 74 Indian candidates to achieve 1 successful Indian hire in our sector. And if you're Arab, you actually fare worse. It's 78 to 1. Now, if you compare that back to how easy or difficult it is to get into our sector if you're a white candidates are getting into our sector at the rate of 16 to 1. So for every 16 white candidates, 1 candidate will successfully get entry into the sector. So we know, I mean, what does that tell us? Well, we know obviously, this point was made earlier, there's a big problem with expecting those who are working in recruitment, either recruitment professionals or those who are involved in the hiring process from technical or other business backgrounds, that they know how to actually put procedures and processes in place that are going to overcome the barriers that are faced. And the point was made earlier about barriers versus hurdles. I think when it comes to recruitment, for me, they're definitely barriers because they shouldn't be there in the first place. And if we focus on upskilling those who are involved in that process of bringing people into the sector, then we can smash those figures. When you look at some of the other data, for example, we know about representation in the sector. We compare to ONS data, so the Office of National Statistics, in terms of the general population. We don't compare to construction-specific data, otherwise we make ourselves look very good. So if we look at that, we've got 18.5% of the community in the UK come from ethnic or black backgrounds, ethnic minority or black backgrounds. In our sector, we're sitting at 17.5% representation. So you might look at that and think, okay, so there's only 1% difference in our sector between those in the community and those who come from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. But the issue becomes really acute when you start looking at what jobs are they actually doing. So, you know, what level and what quality of jobs do we have people from different backgrounds doing? We know we have an ethnic pay gap of 8.3% based on the data from last year. That tells us that we have more people from those backgrounds in lower paying or less highly qualified jobs. We do, I have to mention, we do, that data set is a lot smaller because not many companies are actually collecting data on the ethnic pay gap, and they should be. So only 4% of those who responded to our survey actually collect data around ethnicity and therefore can analyse their pay gap. Interestingly, we've got 28% of people who responded who actually do want to, so 28% of the companies that aren't are intending to collect that data, which is really encouraging. But equally, leaves, I think it is about 68%, the majority, that don't collect it and don't intend to collect it. So how are we actually going to understand the makeup of our workforce, the challenges that we're facing if we don't have the data in the first place? And one more point, I think we touched on attrition earlier, and you know, the rates of attrition and reasons why we're losing people. Again, we can look at the data and see that roughly it's about 17.7% of people who are leaving the sector are coming from ethnic and minority and black backgrounds, and when we look at 17.5% in the sector, so it's roughly about the same rates. But A lot of people are not collecting data on ethnicity, so they don't know the ethnic background of the staff that are leaving. And a further, I think it's about 3.5% of people aren't comfortable disclosing that at that leaving stage when that data is gathered. So we've got a big issue around both level of comfort and the psychological safety factor of what people are self-reporting within their own organisations, and then what organisations are actually collecting about their own workforce, so that they can really use that data to work out where are the problems, and when we take action, what action should we be taking to target them.
Just before I just go to the panel, so I mean, I was making a note of the ratios, and it's quite stark, really. And something that shot out at me, and I don't know whether or not this is just conjecture, but networking, being able to intermingle with people before you get work, having those relationships, because as you were talking, I thought about one of my jobs, which I got, even though I was academically qualified, did well, I got my job on the back of a game of rugby. No, seriously, I played rugby to a pretty good level. You can't tell that now. But it was off the back of a game of rugby that I started talking to someone who was an architect, who just happened to be looking for someone, right? And again, this is about how one tries to expand one network, not just because of academia, but because of the things that you enjoy doing. You know that thing about people like us, right? You can tell I'm a British-born Nigerian, even from my name, and I'm proud of it. But the fact that I could actually catch the ball, run, and score meant that the person who employed me kind of liked those traits as well, and because it was a team-building thing. So, are we able, irrespective of the data, to actually try and enforce the importance of networking? The organizations that are on the panel, BPIC, Women in Architecture, in order to try and raise the stakes and create better opportunities. Osita, you're...
Yeah. It'd be good to come in on that, because that confirms the point I was making earlier in terms of building networks. It's not just about your merits or your ability to get through. It's about creating those networks and nurturing it. Are you part of that inner circle? Who do you know? How do you connect? What experience have you had outside of the formal workplace? But an important point in that is that within the sector we work in, and to Catherine's point as well around the data is quite key. One of the biggest drivers why HS2 we've been successful around diversity, not just in the supply chain, but corporately, we collect data from every single one of our suppliers who work with us and their subcontractors to be able to build up a picture over the last 7 years of what they're delivering on, where the gaps are, and where they need to be. And most of all the suppliers that work for us are accredited in some shape or form around diversity. And that accreditation is important because it's like an external audit. It shows you, despite all the sort of marketing you might want to do in this area, to say you're great on an ethnicity or gender, what really matters is what you're delivering and the impact you're making. And that external verification standard, as part of the accreditation, is a measure of your success. And many of our suppliers have got that as a badge to say, this is where we are, and we reaccredit in the next 3 years. So on ethnicity, what we're finding is that, yes, you can get people through the door, as Catherine has said. The problem is keeping them. And people are leaving. They're probably leaving. We're not sure if they're leaving the sector or they're leaving the organization to go to another competitor within the built environment. And that's the challenge we have. And to be honest, the sector, when you think about it, whether you're an architect, whether you're a planner, whether you're a surveyor, there's still some attitudes that create barriers for ethnic minorities. So we've got about 4 surveyors who are working for us on land and property. So they acquire land and property through the route for HS2. And at the start of the contract, they've told us consistently, oh yeah, we do well on ethnic diversity and everything else. I said, how do you know that? How do you measure that? They said, well, we do lots of those sort of entry-level programs. We go out to primary schools, we do lots of things around apprenticeship programs and graduates. I said, that's great. But that doesn't actually hit the very group we're talking about. So there's an equation around some organization understanding that diversity is actually dealing with the sort of entry level, not professional level. So the likes of you and I, from ethnic minority background, they won't see us as a professional. What they're looking at is the entry level. let's nurture that. Let's do things around skills, employment, and education, and that's enough for us. So we need to start challenging attitudes that already exist within the sector, and only then can we start to look at how we improve retention, because I think it's an important part.
Michelle?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I felt like crying as Catherine was giving out all those stats, actually. Really disheartening and dispiriting. But I think, I mean, you know, to come back to the question of meritocracy and some of the stuff behind us, as Catherine's talked about, people already in the sector, and as a group of professional bodies, we're also looking at that people who are trying to enter the sector, and in particular, people on our accredited courses. And what we know is that in the formal education setup, diversity looks good. We're actually doing better on our accredited courses than ONS stats, right? So more than 20% in planning accredited courses, more than 20% of these students come from Black and Asian backgrounds, much bigger than what you might anticipate. And that's not unique to planning courses. We see that across all of the people who sit around the MOU table, but actually you see that in HE just generally. Black and Asian people are in those courses, they're in them, and they're in them at high numbers, and they're not getting into the jobs, right? So so the idea that people can go through a formal training program and do well and then get the job, the stats are not backing that up. There's very little evidence that suggests that is exactly what happens. Catherine's giving you the stats about the number of applicants. We know that actually, based on who's in education and who's on our courses, those stats should not look like that, but yet they do. So you know, there is something that's utterly and completely broken, and we need to be absolutely honest about it, right? Because if we're absolutely not going to change it, and we need to look at all of it, and I think we need to question really hard the idea of networks. Is that the right way for something like this to work? If you have to figure out how to play rugby, no offense, to be an architect, I mean, what are we saying here? Is it more important for an architect to be able to understand the intricacies of a scrum and whether or not the ball's been put in straight or not, right? Or not use rack? And I think I know which one I'd prefer, an architect.
I do know that. Trust me.
And I'm not suggesting you don't, but I'm just, you know, as a general, and you know, and the same for planners. You know, actually, I would much rather, you know, I don't care how well they play football. I want them to know, I want to understand that they understand what it means when we're thinking about healthy communities and what that means if you're trying to create a 20-minute neighborhood. If they're going to be building walls and doing bricklaying in construction, I don't want that all to fall down. You know, I don't care how good they play Fortnite. Do you know, so I think we really need to look at all of the things which we have typically leaned on as a sector, and to sort of how the sector generates itself, and ask, actually, that doesn't work. From an EDI point of view, it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We need to change it. And that needs to be, and that takes honesty, bravery, and leadership, and we have to do it. Sorry.
So, I do agree with you, but everyone needs a break, right? Chanel, obviously you work at Savills, many offices, many different disciplines. How do you go about trying to create a diverse organisation?
I don't think there's only one way of doing that. There's lots of different ways of creating diversity and diverse organisations, but culture. And I think for me, it's around inclusion as the penultimate, the goal. Like, the people feel like they belong within the organisation. Doesn't matter, you know, what particular characteristic that they are, that they're not, that everybody feels like they belong and that everybody has got access to opportunity. That, for me, is the goal and the vision for what true D&I is within Savills. It's a large organisation, it's global, it's got different kind of issues in different places, but it's around creating something that everybody is able to identify with. So we've got a strategy that we launched last year, which is around 3 strategic pillars of how we attract diverse people, how we develop diverse people, but ultimately how we lead the organisation to have an inclusive culture, because that underpins absolutely everything else. Looking at intersectionality as well, because people are more than, you know, just one thing. They're multiple different things. They intersect differently. My lived experience of being somebody who's mixed race is not going to be the lived experience of somebody else who's a black woman, for example. Like, they're very different. So you have to look at that. If you add something else like disability into it, and social mobility as well, because that tends to intersect with all of the different characteristics and makes life quite a bit more difficult for you if you come from a low socio-economic background. What do we do around people that have multiple different characteristics? So we really try to look at it in that way. We have working groups, we have networks, but ultimately our senior leaders have to take accountability for the D&I strategy, because it's not just me as the head of D&I that owns D&I. Actually, it's the entire organisation that owns D&I. And this is where I agree, it's bottom and top, so everybody has to. So I always go around testing people, what are our 3 strategic pillars on the D&I strategy, just to see whether or not it's embedded and it's landed with them, because often some people will just completely disengage from the conversation, and that's everywhere that I've gone. If you have a bad culture in an organisation, people, for fear of saying the wrong thing, will say nothing at all. So we try and create a culture that's like, if you get it wrong, and you might get it wrong, I get it wrong, and I'm a professional sometimes, it's okay if you hold your hands up and just say, do you know what, I didn't realise, and I'm sorry that offended you, or that was the wrong terminology, and I've learned something today. If you sit there and be pig-headed about it and go, oh, I didn't mean that, then that's not great. But if you completely just don't say anything at all, that's even worse, like just to completely resist the entire conversation. So I think, again, it comes back to the culture point that we started with, having a culture where everybody feels like they can belong, where people can ask questions, where people are able to be their whole selves, their true selves, but also that there isn't a cancel culture either within the organisation, and people are allowed to learn. So that's how we tackle it.
Thank you. I'm sorry I pointed directly at you because of the good work I know that Savills does, but it just shows that there has to be will from the very top as well in order to try and drive it, and also to make those leaders accountable for the results.
I will say, though, I think it might have been Priya's point from this morning, we also acknowledge that we are on a journey. Like, we acknowledge we have not got it right, and that we are, moving forward with that. So, and I think having that accountability where we say, do you know what, we have made mistakes, we are on a journey, I think that's really important for organisations to do that.
Which is a fantastic segue to my question to Michelle about the work that professional bodies are doing through the MOU and the action plan that I suppose we've all committed to try and do with this discussion.
Gosh, well, I mean, some of it's already been covered, so there is a data element to that. So it's, for those who've not attempted to read this 42-point action plan, and I do wake up sometimes wondering, how did we manage to get to 42?
It's the meaning of life.
It's 48, isn't it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But in 3 broad areas. One is data collection, building on what Catherine said, and Asita, and I'm sure Chanel will agree that we need to understand, we need information. We still, rightly or wrongly, we live and work in a context where people will always say, well, what's the evidence for that? And it's often not enough to say, just to talk about it and say, I know it's the case. So we do need this evidence, we need to gather this data, and it needs to be done in a much more consistent way. So what the 6 of us have been doing is trying to get a bit more consistency around that approach, so that we're all collecting, or we can start to move and encourage and influence and help and cajole, etc., everybody across the sector to start collecting all of the data that we really need. So just to give you, it's not just about architecture. The RTPI we didn't collect when I joined 2.5 years ago. We were not collecting around religion or sexual orientation by default. So we're going to be starting to do that, and other professional membership bodies around the table are going to be increasing the questions that we ask, so we have as much information, and can also start to deal with the intersectionality of some of this stuff, which I know is something Helen was really touching on earlier this morning, because we have to also always be careful not to assume that if we fix the problem for a black man, we fixed it for all people. That just doesn't work like that. The other area is around, and I've talked about it a little bit already, it's actually what is actually happening in terms of the entry points into the professions. Why is it that we can have such good representation on our training programs, in our formal education processes, but not see that reflected in our membership? I said the UK domiciled Black and Asian student population on UK accredited courses is 20%, Black and Asian communities. RTPI membership is 10%. Estimates for the profession as a whole, 5%. Something is very wrong. We need to understand exactly what that is. Mark mentioned the awarding gap. That's going to be an issue, and we'll see that reflected if that awarding gap is affecting graduate recruitment because people are asking for 2-1s and higher. What does that mean for the students who are on our program, etc., and so on. But also what's happening on those courses themselves. Are people leaving those courses at a rate we wouldn't anticipate, and so on. So there's a lot of work for us to do around that. And lastly, what does it mean to be a competent EDI person in the...
I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank this panel because they were fantastic. Please give them a round of applause. Sorry.